The war had no beginning anyone could agree on anymore. It simply was. For 60 years, the Croth advance had moved across the conclave frontier with the quiet certainty of mathematics. No rage. No chaos. No improvisation. Only progression. Every engagement resolved before it fully formed. Every countermeasure already accounted for. Every defensive line treated not as resistance, but as a temporary inconvenience in a calculation that always returned the same answer. Advance. It was not even called war in most Croth records. It was logistics. It was correction. It was the alignment of inefficient space into efficient order. Worlds did not fall. They were reassigned. Fleets did not break. They were reclassified. Civilizations did not resist for long, because resistance itself had already been modeled and discounted. And so the galaxy learned a quiet truth it never said out loud. The Croth did not lose wars. They only arrived later in them. At the edge of known space, the conclave held together out of habit more than hope. 7 species, dozens of fractured alliances, centuries of failed counteroffensives layered over each other like scars that never fully healed. Every strategy had been tried. Every doctrine had been rewritten. Every miracle had been reduced to a footnote in the next defeat. Admiral Sareth had spent more than half his life watching red lines advance across holographic maps. He no longer asked when they would stop. Only where. Because stopping was not something the Croth did. It was something that happened to other species. And then the bastard's bargain arrived. It did not enter the system with ceremony. There were no heroic transmissions, no proud declarations of intent. It drifted in like something that had simply decided the universe had not yet provided it a reason to be elsewhere. Old hull. Patchwork plating. A silhouette that did not belong to any modern fleet architecture. If anything about it suggested importance, it was only the way sensors struggled to agree on what it was. Some systems labeled it auxiliary logistics. Others classified it as civilian salvage. A few simply failed to categorize it at all and returned error loops that no technician wanted to interpret too deeply. It carried no visible threat signature worth escalating. Which, in hindsight, was the first mistake anyone made about it. Commander Marsh arrived with it. She did not present herself as a savior or a genius, or anything remotely dramatic enough to satisfy the expectations of a war that had long since grown addicted to dramatic failure. She spoke like someone who had already finished most of her thinking long before the conversation began. When she entered the conclave war room, the maps were already wrong. They had been wrong for years. Everyone knew this. They were just wrong in ways that could still be collectively agreed upon, which made them useful. Marsh looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that did not sound like strategy at first. "They don't adapt," she said. That alone would have been dismissed if she had stopped there. But she did not. They don't need to. Their system assumes continuity. Every variable they calculate is built on the assumption that the system behaves as it has behaved before. They don't model failure outside of known failure states. Sareth remembered thinking that this was not useful information. Every enemy had weaknesses. Every system had blind spots. That was not new. But then she added something that changed the shape of the room without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. "We don't break them," she said. "We remove their certainty." Silence followed, not because anyone agreed, but because no one could immediately translate the sentence into something that fit inside existing doctrine. Certainty was not a target. It was not a resource. It was not something you could strike or sabotage or disable. And yet, as she spoke, Sareth found himself imagining it anyway. A machine that continued functioning perfectly while no longer trusting any of its own outputs. A fleet that moved exactly as planned, but no longer believed the plan was valid. A war that still advanced but no longer knew why it should. He did not like the thought. Not because it was impossible, but because it sounded like something that might work. And in a war like this one, anything that sounded like it might work was already dangerous. Marsh finally tapped the edge of the map, and the bastard's bargain shifted into focus as if it had been waiting for permission to matter. "One ship," she said calmly. "Not because it is all we have. Because it is all this situation requires." Sareth frowned at that, but he did not interrupt. Across 60 years of retreat, he had learned that certainty was rare. But patterns were not. Anne Marsh, standing in front of a war that had never been meaningfully interrupted, spoke as if she had already seen where the pattern ended. That was the first time anyone in the room understood the real risk. Not that she was wrong, but that she might not be guessing at all. And somewhere beyond the maps, beyond the fleets, beyond the accumulated weight of every failed campaign that had come before, the bastard's bargain sat quietly in orbit and waited. Not for orders, But for the moment the universe would finally say the right thing. Continue. They did not approve the plan immediately. That was the first reassuring thing about it. In the conclave, anything that succeeded too quickly was usually followed by a correction, and corrections in this war tended to be fatal. So when Commander Marsh finished her briefing and the room did not respond for a full 17 seconds, she did not interpret it as rejection. She interpreted it as processing. Admiral Sareth, however, was not processing the idea of disruption. He was processing the simplicity of it. Supply lines, communication channels, sensor confidence, not destruction, not confrontation, not battle, interference. It sounded almost too modest to matter. And that was what made it dangerous. Because the Croth advance had been built on a foundation that assumed every system remained legible. Even when resisted, even when obstructed, even when delayed, it had always been able to understand the shape of what opposed it. Marsh was suggesting that understanding itself could be broken. Another officer finally spoke, a Velhari logistics commander whose species had spent centuries turning supply theory into an art form. If we interrupt their logistics, they reroute, he said. They always reroute. Yes, Marsh replied immediately. And that is what we want. The room tilted slightly in perception, though no one physically moved. Sareth narrowed his eyes. Explain. Marsh stepped closer to the holographic display. Her hand moved, and the Croth advance lines expanded across the projection like a living organism frozen mid-motion. They have never had to deal with inconsistent failure, she said. Every disruption they have encountered has been attributable, traceable, categorized. Even when it was complex, it was still consistent. She paused. This means they trust their recovery models. No one interrupted her this time. She continued. If you damage a bridge, they build a bypass. If you destroy a relay, they establish redundancy. If you block a corridor, they reroute through optimized alternatives. Every response reinforces their confidence that the system can be recovered. Sareth folded his arms. So we make the damage worse. No, Marsh said. That single word carried more certainty than anything else in the room. We make it uncertain. She adjusted the display again. Now the supply arteries flickered. Not broken. Not destroyed. Unstable. Inconsistent delay patterns, she said. Minor signal desynchronization. Slight mismatches between expected and observed transit times. Enough to be noticeable. Not enough to localize. A junior analyst frowned. That would be dismissed as noise. Exactly, Marsh said. The word landed harder than anything else she had said. Sareth leaned forward slightly now. You are suggesting we attack their ability to trust their own instrumentation. Marsh looked at him directly. I am suggesting, she said, that for the first time in their operational history, their models will begin returning different answers depending on when they are asked. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. This one had weight, because everyone in the room understood models. Models were not predictions. They were identity. The Croth did not improvise. They calculated. And they calculated because calculation had never failed them in a meaningful way. If Marsh was correct, then the first failure would not be loss of ships or territory. It would be contradiction. Sareth exhaled slowly. And you believe they will not adapt to that? They will adapt, Marsh said immediately. She did not hesitate. That is not the point. A few officers exchanged glances. Marsh continued. They will adapt incorrectly. Because they will assume consistency somewhere still exists. They will assume the fault lies in interpretation, or signal degradation, or environmental noise. They will not assume that the system itself has become unreliable. She turned slightly, looking across the entire room now. And that assumption will propagate. That was when Sareth understood the second layer of the plan. It was not to destroy the Croth system. It was to force it to correct itself into fragmentation. Because every correction they made would be based on a model that was no longer stable. A young Dorith officer finally spoke, quieter now. They will begin to disagree internally. Yes, Marsh said. Another pause. And that, she added, is where they have never been before. No one responded. Because there was nothing obvious to respond with. The Croth advance had never relied on unity in the emotional sense. It relied on functional coherence. Even when divided, even when decentralized, every part still agreed on the underlying truth of the system. Remove that truth and the structure did not fall. It multiplied into competing interpretations of reality. Sareth looked at the bastard's bargain designation on the tactical overlay again. One ship, he said quietly. Marsh did not correct him this time. Instead, she said something that reframed the entire discussion. One ship in the right place, she said, is not an asset. It is a question. That word lingered longer than expected. Question. Not weapon. Not fleet. Not force. Question. And somewhere far beyond the edge of mapped space, the bastard's bargain began its final pre-calibration cycle, adjusting systems that had not been used in open conflict since before most of the Conclave commanders in the room had been born. It did not move yet. It waited, because the first part of the plan was not execution. It was timing. And the Kroth, for the first time in 60 years of advance, were about to be asked something their entire civilization had never learned how to answer. The bastard's bargain did not cross the border like a warship. It crossed like a mistake the universe had not yet corrected. Sensors on the Conclave perimeter stations registered it late, and even then, inconsistently. One array flagged it as a transient shadow and gravitational noise. Another insisted nothing had passed at all. A third logged a contact and then quietly rewrote its own record 37 seconds later without prompting. By the time anyone agreed something had moved, it was already inside Kroth-controlled space. And still nothing fired. No alarms escalated beyond advisory status. No fleets were redirected. No defensive doctrines activated in full response. Because there was still no classification for what it was doing. It was not attacking. It was not hiding in any meaningful sense either. It was simply becoming absent wherever attention tried to fix it. Admiral Sareth watched the sensor feeds with a discomfort he did not immediately name. This is interference masking, a technician said. Passive stealth field with adaptive signature drift. No, Sareth replied after a pause. He did not elaborate because he did not yet have the words. Across the system, Kroth logistics nodes began to report the first anomalies. Nothing dramatic. A convoy arriving 6 minutes late. A relay transmitting with a fractional phase delay that corrected itself before anyone could isolate it. A supply calculation that returned two equally valid solutions depending on which feed it was compared against. On their own, each event was nothing. The Kroth did not react to nothing. That was part of their strength. But Marsh had not built a weapon that created something. She had built something that broke agreement about what nothing meant. At the edge of the inner supply corridor, a Kroth convoy adjusted its course automatically. The system had already calculated a minor inefficiency in its planned route. A standard reroute was issued. But at the destination node, no corresponding confirmation arrived. The convoy adjusted again. Then again. Each adjustment was logical. Each correction was correct according to at least one version of the data. And none of those versions matched each other. Within an hour, 3 separate Kroth command subroutines issued 3 different interpretations of the same logistical state. All 3 were valid. And therefore incompatible. The Kroth did not panic. They escalated verification. That was their instinct. Their discipline. Their certainty made procedural. But verification requires a stable reference point. And Marsh had removed the idea that any single reference point could be trusted without comparison. Inside the bastard's bargain, Petty Officer Van watched the disruption array outputs fluctuate across multiple spectrum bands. Signal divergence increasing, she reported calmly. Lieutenant or didn't look up from his console. Expected. Yes, she said. Within projected tolerance. Then we continue. There was no celebration in the room. No sense of triumph. Only maintenance. Like holding a pressure seal in place while the hull tried to decide whether it still agreed with itself. On Kroth High Command channels, the first meaningful confusion emerged. Not fear. Not loss. Confusion about interpretation. A single supply hub reported inconsistent inventory states across 3 synchronized databases. One system showed surplus. One showed deficit. One showed normal distribution with delayed confirmation cycles. All 3 were technically correct depending on which communication layer was considered authoritative. A Kroth coordinator issued a correction order. The order itself split into 2 versions during transmission. Neither version was incomplete. Both versions were actionable. But they pointed in different directions. And for the first time in decades of conquest, 2 Kroth divisions executed different interpretations of the same command without realizing they had diverged. Admiral Sareth saw it on the conclave display before anyone had time to fully understand it. What is that? A Velhari analyst asked. Sareth did not answer immediately. Because the display was no longer showing a simple advance line. It was showing branching. Not retreat. Not collapse. Branching decision trees forming inside a military structure that had never allowed decision trees to exist at the tactical level. Marcia's voice came through the channel before anyone requested it. "We are not breaking their fleet," she said. Her tone was calm. "We are breaking their assumption that they are still one fleet." Sareth leaned forward. "That is not a sustainable effect." "It doesn't need to be sustainable," Marsh replied. Pause. "It only needs to last long enough for them to start trusting the wrong version of themselves." On the edge of Croth-controlled space, another convoy disappeared from synchronized tracking. Not destroyed. Not intercepted. Just absent from agreement. And in 3 separate command centers, 3 separate Croth officers all reported that everything was functioning normally according to their local system. And all 3 were correct. Which was the beginning of the problem. Because for the Croth, correctness had always been singular. Now it was plural. And plural correctness was indistinguishable from failure that had not yet chosen its shape. The first time the Croth realized something was wrong, they did not call it an attack. They called it a deviation. That word mattered more than anyone in the conclave initially understood. Deviation implied that the system was still correct. That reality itself remained stable. That only a small portion of expected behavior had wandered off course and required correction. The bastard's bargain did not change anything in a way that could be cleanly isolated. It changed relationships between things. Supply routes no longer agreed with their own timestamps. Communication relays delivered messages that were internally consistent but externally contradictory. Sensor arrays confirmed the presence of fleets that other sensor arrays insisted had already moved. And every correction the Croth attempted only multiplied the inconsistencies. Because each correction was based on whichever version of reality was locally most stable. Admiral Sareth watched the reports accumulate with a growing sense that he was no longer looking at battlefield intelligence. He was looking at a system arguing with itself. "That's not jamming," a technician said. "It's not spoofing either. The signatures are too clean. It's like the data is splitting." "Splitting?" Sareth repeated. The word felt wrong, but he did not replace it. Because nothing better had appeared. Across Croth space, supply convoys began to experience what they initially classified as timing drift. Arrivals were correct. Departures were correct. Transit durations were correct. But when compared across nodes, none of them agreed simultaneously. A convoy would leave a staging station at the exact scheduled time, arrive at its destination on time, and still be marked as both late and early depending on which branch of the communication network reported it. At first, Croth logistics assumed corrupted synchronization layers. They rebuilt the synchronization architecture. The discrepancies increased. Then they introduced redundancy verification across independent relay chains. The discrepancies multiplied again. Then they attempted centralized reconciliation. And that was when the first fractures appeared in operational coherence. Because centralized reconciliation requires agreement on a single authoritative timeline. And the bastard's bargain had ensured there was no longer such a thing. Inside Croth Eastern Command, 3 adjacent processing cores generated 3 separate operational maps of the same sector. Each map was internally perfect. Each map contradicted the others. A senior Croth analyst requested confirmation from High Command. High Command responded with an order. The order arrived in 2 forms. Both were official. Both were stamped with identical authentication sequences. One instructed rerouting of supply convoys to stabilize delayed shipyards. The other instructed acceleration of forward logistics to compensate for perceived supply surplus. Both were correct within their own data environment. Neither acknowledged the existence of the other. The analyst stared at both orders for 17 seconds longer than Croth procedure allowed. Then executed the first one. Not because it was more correct, but because it matched the version of reality his subsystem had last stabilized. Within 6 hours, the shipyard cluster reported contradictory status conditions. One sector believed it was undersupplied and began emergency rationing protocols. Another believed it was overstocked and began redistribution to forward fleets. A third reported no anomaly at all. All 3 reports were transmitted simultaneously into the same command stream. And for the first time in Croth operational history, High Command systems flagged internal contradiction as a persistent, non-resolvable condition. They did not have a category for that. So they created one. Environmental information instability. It sounded harmless. It was not. On the bastard's bargain, Petty Officer Van adjusted the disruption array by a fraction of a %. Propagation depth increasing, she said. Lieutenant or nodded once. Effect on coordination? Nonlinear. Accelerating. Good, or said quietly. Keep it contained to phase grid 3. No one asked what would happen if it wasn't contained, because they all already knew the answer. Admiral Sareth received the first real confirmation that something fundamental had changed when a Kroth convoy simply stopped reporting itself as coherent. Not destroyed. Not lost. Declared internally inconsistent by its own command network. The convoy still existed physically, but no two Kroth systems could agree on what it was doing at any given moment. It's spreading, the Velhari analyst said. Sareth did not look away from the display. Yes, he said. Pause. And it's learning how they think. That was the unsettling part. The system was not simply disrupting communication. It was exploiting the structure of how the Kroth defined truth. Every correction they made reinforced the fragmentation. Every attempt to unify data created new branches of contradiction. And still the Kroth did not retreat. Because nothing had been lost. Not yet. Only certainty. And certainty, for them, had never been considered something that could fail independently of everything else. Until now. Marcia's voice came again through the channel, quieter this time. Phase effects are stabilizing, she said. Sareth frowned. Stabilizing. Yes, she replied. Pause. Now they begin to adapt. Sareth felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Adapt how? There was a moment before she answered. When a system can no longer trust its global state, Marsh said, it starts relying on local truth. Another pause. And when enough local truths diverge, coordination becomes optional. Sareth looked at the map again. The Kroth advance line was no longer a line. It was a scattering of decisions pretending to still be connected. And for the first time in 60 years of war, the enemy was no longer moving as one thing. It was moving as many. And none of them fully agreed on what forward meant anymore. The Kroth did not notice the collapse at first. That was the most dangerous part. Because nothing in their system failed in a way that could be labeled as failure. There were no alarms that triggered universally. No catastrophic loss events. No broken fleets drifting dead in space. Instead there was divergence. Small at first. Statistically acceptable. Within tolerance thresholds. A convoy recalculating its route 3 times instead of once. A command node issuing 2 corrective interpretations of the same update. A shipyard optimizing production schedules that no longer matched neighboring yards. Each individual system insisted it was functioning correctly. And each was correct. Locally. Admiral Sareth watched the operational map change shape in real time. What had once been a single advancing front now resembled fractured geometry, like something that had been shattered but still retained its original outline out of habit. They're compensating, a Velhari analyst said. Sareth didn't answer immediately, because compensation implied control. And control implied unity. Neither of those things were visible anymore. Across Kroth space, High Command attempted what it had always done in response to anomalies. It centralized authority. It issued synchronization directives across all affected systems, forcing alignment to a master timeline. For approximately 6 minutes, it appeared to work. The maps briefly stabilized. Supply chains aligned. Communication nodes agreed on shared state. And then the bastard's bargain adjusted a single parameter in its disruption field. No one detected the change directly. Only its consequence. Because the synchronization itself became the source of contradiction. The master timeline was now being interpreted through corrupted reference points. And suddenly there were multiple master timelines. Each one mathematically valid. Each one incompatible with the others. On Kroth Eastern Logistics Net, a senior coordinator attempted to reconcile convoy statuses across 3 overlapping data feeds. All 3 feeds confirmed different truths. Convoy A was ahead of schedule. Convoy A was delayed. Convoy A had already arrived and been reassigned. The coordinator escalated the discrepancy. The escalation split into 2 branches during transmission. Both reached High Command. Both were logged. Neither overwrote the other. Because the system could no longer determine which authority had priority. Inside minutes, Kroth divisions began receiving orders that referenced conditions they could not verify. Not because the data was wrong, but because there was no longer a single version of correct to compare it against. Admiral Sareth leaned forward. This is internal coherence failure, he said quietly. A junior analyst looked up. Sir? The system is still intact, Sareth continued. But it is no longer unified. No one responded. Because the implication was obvious. A fleet does not need to be destroyed to stop being a fleet. It only needs to stop agreeing with itself. On Kroth Forward Shipyard Cluster Theta 9, production schedules began to drift in opposite directions. One facility ramped up production under the assumption of supply surplus. Another reduced output under the assumption of incoming shortages. A third attempted to compensate for both by splitting production priorities into incompatible branches. Raw material convoys arrived to find receiving stations that no longer matched their expected intake configuration. Some stations accepted deliveries. Some rejected them. Some accepted partial deliveries based on conditions that no longer existed anywhere else in the system. And still, each node insisted it was operating correctly. Because it was. Within its own interpretation of reality. The Croft did not panic. They optimized. That was their instinct under uncertainty. But optimization requires agreement on what is being optimized. And now there were multiple definitions of success, competing inside the same system. On the Bastard's bargain, Lieutenant or watched the escalation graphs rise. We're past threshold 2, he said. Petty Officer Van didn't look up from her console. Expected fragmentation? Yes, or said. Still contained? For now. Pause. Then Van added, almost clinically, they're starting to localize truth. Or nodded once. That's the point. Because Marsh's strategy was never to erase the Croft system. It was to force it inward. To remove the global layer where coordination lived. And leave only isolated pockets of certainty that no longer agreed with each other. Back on the Conclave flagship, Admiral Sareth watched as an entire Croft operational sector effectively split into 3 independent behaviors without any formal division order. One segment advanced. One held position. One began repositioning supply lines backward to stabilize perceived overextension. All 3 actions were rational. All 3 were correct. None of them matched. A Dorith officer spoke quietly. They're fragmenting into self-consistent subsystems. Sareth exhaled slowly. Yes, he said. And none of those subsystems are aware of each other anymore. That was the shift. Not chaos. Isolation. Each Croft unit still functioned. But it functioned alone. And alone, no part of the system could guarantee it was aligned with anything beyond itself. Across the battle space, Croft commanders began to notice something new in their reports. Not error. Not loss. Disagreement. Between systems that had once been identical. Between datasets that had once been unified. Between interpretations that could no longer be reconciled without choosing one version of reality and discarding the others. And the Croft had never been forced to choose reality before. They had only ever calculated it. Now calculation returned multiple answers. And none of them could be disproven without assuming another was wrong. Which assumption itself was no longer stable. Sareth stared at the map for a long time. The advance had not stopped. But it had ceased to behave as a single phenomenon. It had become many small, perfect, incompatible truths moving independently through space. And somewhere deep in Croft territory, unseen and unchallenged, the Bastard's bargain continued to whisper inconsistency into the structure of certainty itself. The Croft did not recognize fear. Not in the way younger species did. Fear, to them, implied emotional deviation from rational assessment. It was an inefficiency, something that had been modeled out of command behavior early in their development cycle. Decisions were not made under fear. They were made under probability weighting. Which is why, when the first true instability spread through their systems, they did not identify it as fear. They identified it as unexplained variance. And then, slowly, as variance persisted, as corrections failed to converge, as local truths continued to diverge without resolution, a different condition began to emerge. Something they had never needed a word for. Because it had never been relevant. Uncertainty without boundary. Admiral Sareth watched it unfold across the tactical display with a stillness that came from long exposure to irreversible events. The Croft advance was still moving. But it was no longer coherent. Entire formations were executing perfectly rational maneuvers that contradicted the movements of adjacent formations. Supply chains were being optimized in mutually incompatible directions. Communication nodes were functioning flawlessly while delivering fundamentally irreconcilable command interpretations. Nothing was broken. Everything was disagreeing. A Velhari analyst finally spoke, voice subdued. They're beginning to correct too aggressively. Sareth didn't look away from the display. Explain. They're attempting to resolve contradictions at every level simultaneously, she said. Local nodes are overriding regional nodes. Regional nodes are overriding central command. Central command is issuing stabilization directives that reintroduce contradiction elsewhere in the system. Pause. It's self-amplifying. That word mattered. Self-amplifying errors were not new in warfare. but they usually required damage, corruption, or external destruction to initiate. Here, nothing had been destroyed. Only agreement had been removed, and that was proving sufficient. Across Croft-controlled space, communication traffic increased by an order of magnitude. Not because more information was being sent, but because the same information was being sent in multiple, competing correction cycles. Each attempt to stabilize the system produced new inconsistencies elsewhere. A convoy corrected its arrival time based on updated central data. That correction caused its receiving station to reject the convoy's existence as scheduled. The convoy then issued a verification override. The override split into two authoritative versions. Both propagated upward. Both were accepted. Neither was reconciled. Inside Croth High Command, processing cores that had never once needed manual intervention began requesting human-equivalent confirmation protocols. Not because they were confused, but because internal consensus could no longer be achieved through automated arbitration. And arbitration had always been the foundation of Croth certainty. Now arbitration itself was fragmented. On the Bastard's Bargain, Petty Officer Van monitored the widening instability band. Propagation is no longer linear, she said. Lieutenant or nodded once. Phase boundary breach? Confirmed. Or leaned slightly closer to the display. Psychological layer? Van hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, emerging. That was the first time anyone aboard the ship said the word out loud in reference to the Croth system. Psychological. Because until now, everything had been treated as structural. A breakdown of logistics. A corruption of communication. A failure of synchronization architecture. But now the behavior was changing. The Croth were no longer just reacting to bad data. They were reacting to the experience of contradiction itself. And that was something deeper. Admiral Sareth received the first report of Croth commanders issuing mutually exclusive directives within the same operational window. One fleet ordered forward advance. The same fleet, under a parallel command stream, ordered consolidation and defensive stabilization. Both orders were valid. Both were executed. The fleet split operational behavior without physically splitting formation. It was still one fleet, but it was acting like several. Sareth closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the map had changed again. The Croth advance was no longer a front. It was a field of competing intentions. Each intention internally coherent. Each intention externally incompatible. They're losing hierarchical integrity, a Dorith officer said quietly. Sareth nodded. Yes. Pause. But they're still functioning. No one corrected him. Because that was the most disturbing part. The Croth had not collapsed. They had adapted. But adaptation in a system designed for absolute coherence was not stabilization. It was transformation into something that no longer fit its original purpose. Across Croth space, High Command attempted one final unification protocol. A system-wide synchronization broadcast designed to reassert a single authoritative state across all nodes. For exactly 4 seconds it appeared to work. The system aligned. The data converged. The contradictions temporarily resolved. And then every local node updated based on its most recent independent correction cycle, which did not match the synchronization broadcast. And the system fractured again. Harder this time. Not into chaos, but into persistent parallel truths that refused to collapse back into one another. Sareth finally spoke, voice low. They can't rejoin it. A Velhari analyst responded softly. Rejoin what, Admiral? Sareth looked at the map. At the advancing non-line that was no longer a line. At the empire that was no longer singular. At the war that was still happening but no longer agreeing on how it was happening. And he said the only honest answer left. Themselves. Far beyond the mapped systems, the Bastard's Bargain maintained its quiet interference, not increasing, not expanding, simply sustaining a condition in which truth was no longer a shared resource. And for the first time in 60 years of war, the Croth advance did not slow because it was defeated. It slowed because it could no longer decide what moving forward meant. The first countermeasure arrived without announcement, because nothing in craft doctrine had ever been designed for an opponent that could vanish inside their own systems. It began as a correction. That was how their intelligence core classified it. A correction to anomalous traffic patterns. A correction to supply chain divergence. A correction to communication irregularities that had, by now, spread across 11 systems and 2 fleet sectors. In the logic of the Croth High Command, nothing was being attacked. Something was simply wrong. And anything wrong in a perfect system had to be corrected. So they did what they always did. They increased coordination pressure. Across the eastern flank, command relays doubled their transmission frequency. Redundant routing layers were activated. Secondary and tertiary channels were forced open, flooding the network with structured command redundancy designed to overwrite interference through sheer informational density. It was elegant. It was also useless, because the bastard's bargain was not blocking signals. It was changing what those signals meant when they arrived. On the bridge of the Allied flagship, Admiral Sarah watched the first reports come in with a stillness that had become familiar over the past 6 days. The kind of stillness that forms when your brain realizes it is no longer observing a battle, but a system rewriting itself in real time. Signal density increased by 300%, Pratt said quietly. And stability? Sarah asked. Pause. Decreased. That was the part no one in the room liked to say out loud. Because in every doctrine they had ever studied, increased coordination should have meant stability. More control. More certainty. But the Kroth were discovering something that did not exist in their models. When certainty is attacked, increasing it does not strengthen it. It fractures it faster. On the forward display, the eastern flank coordination map flickered again. Not collapse. Not yet. Something more unsettling. Divergence. 11 divisions, each receiving the same instructions, each interpreting them slightly differently based on delayed, corrupted, or misaligned context windows that no longer matched the battlefield they were looking at. Pratt leaned forward. They're compensating, she said. Sarah didn't take his eyes off the display. Yes. They think it's a technical failure. Yes. A silence stretched between them. Then Selvar, standing a step behind, spoke carefully. Sir, if they realize it's not technical. They will, Sarah said. Eventually. And then? Sarah finally looked away from the map. That depends on how long it takes them to understand what they're actually fighting. Because what they were fighting was not sabotage in the traditional sense. It was context erosion. The bastard's bargain had not broken the Kroth communication network. It had simply ensured that no message ever arrived in the same reality it was sent from. On the Kroth side of the frontier, High Command finally issued the second correction order. This one was more aggressive. All fleet sectors were instructed to revert to baseline protocol synchronization. All local autonomy was suspended. Command authority was centralized to a single hardened node cluster deep inside their interior core. They believed isolation would fix the problem. They believed removing complexity would restore order. So they compressed decision-making into fewer points. They concentrated authority. They narrowed interpretation. And in doing so, they did exactly what Commander Marsh had predicted 20 years ago on a paper map pinned to a quiet wall. They made the system brittle. Inside the bastard's bargain, Petty Officer Van watched the telemetry feed with tired eyes and a faint expression that might have been satisfaction if she ever allowed herself that word. They're centralizing, she said. Lieutenant or nodded once. They're trying to stabilize interpretation. And failing. Yes. Van rubbed her eyes. How long until they realize we're not disrupting their comms? Or didn't answer immediately? Because that was the real question. Not capability. Not execution. Understanding. On the forward deck, Commander Marsh stood alone in front of a live feed from the Kroth interior signal lattice. Lines of communication folded across the display like threads being pulled through shifting fabric. They're getting closer, she said quietly. To what? Senior Chief Holm asked from behind her. To the truth that matters. Holm waited. Marsh finally turned slightly. That they don't have a communication problem, she said. They have a certainty problem. Outside the hull, the bastard's bargain continued moving. Not forward. Not deeper. Sideways. Around. Through gaps that did not exist in Kroth defensive mapping because Kroth defensive mapping assumed continuity. Assumed coherence. Assumed that systems behaved like systems. The ship did not behave like a system. It behaved like an answer to a question that had been asked 20 years too early and finally reached its moment of relevance. The Kroth response escalated again on day 7. This time they stopped trying to correct the network. They began isolating the interference source. Fleet interdiction grids activated across 3 sectors. Deep scan arrays were reoriented toward internal vector detection. Entire subregions of space were saturated with active probing pulses designed to force detection through resonance feedback. It was the equivalent of turning on every light in a dark room and demanding the shadow reveal itself. And for the first time, something changed. Not detection. Reaction. On the bastard's bargain, alarms did not sound. Instead, the ship simply adjusted its internal emissions profile. Every scan pulse that passed through its position returned an answer that matched expected environmental noise. It was still there. It was still not there. Both truths held simultaneously long enough for every Croth system attempting to observe it to begin arguing with itself. And that was when the first internal command failure cascade began. Not in the fleet. In analysis. In classification. In interpretation layers that had never been stress-tested against contradiction at this scale. On Croth Command Core Node 7, a senior systems analyst reported something that would later be recorded as the first formal acknowledgement of cognitive dissonance within military processing frameworks. "We are receiving mutually exclusive confirmations of fleet continuity," the report read. "All are statistically valid. None can be reconciled." The system flagged the report as high priority, then flagged it again, then failed to determine which flag had priority. And for a brief moment, nothing in the Croth military architecture knew which version of reality to obey. On the Allied flagship, Admiral Sarah finally received the second broadcast. It came through cleanly. Too cleanly. No distortion. No interference. No fragmentation of signal integrity. Just Commander Marsh's voice, carried across Croth space in formal high Croth register, precise and deliberate. Pratt looked at the translation feed. "She's repeating the argument," she said. Sarah frowned slightly. "Why?" The translator hesitated. "Because they're finally able to hear it correctly." On the display, Marsh's message unfolded again across Croth-controlled systems. Not a threat. Not a demand. A structured enumeration of current operational consequences. Supply chain degradation at measured points. Communication desynchronization across defined sectors. Predictable outcomes if current trajectory continued. Then a pause. And finally, "This is what has changed," Marsh's voice said through translation. "Not your strength. Not your numbers. Not your capability. Your assumption that your system describes reality accurately under all conditions." Silence followed. Then the message continued. "You are not being defeated in battle space. You are being shown a mismatch between model and environment." Sarah exhaled slowly. "She's teaching them," he said. Pratt nodded once. "In the middle of a war." On the Croth side, High Command attempted one final stabilization directive. All fleets were ordered to disregard anomalous reports and proceed under baseline predictive models only. Do not adjust. Do not interpret deviation as failure. Proceed as planned. And for the first time in Croth military history, an entire sector simply did not comply. Not because of rebellion. Not because of resistance. Because the models no longer matched what their sensors were telling them. And an army that could no longer trust its own predictions did the only thing it had never been trained to do. It stopped trusting itself. By the end of Phase 7, the Bastard's Bargain had not fired a single additional shot. It had not destroyed a fleet. It had not shattered infrastructure. It had done something far more dangerous to a system built on certainty. It had made obedience require belief. And belief, once questioned at scale, never returns to its original shape. The Croth High Command did not describe what was happening as fear. They did not have a category for fear at the system level. Instead, they labeled it unverified instability in predictive consensus. It sounded controlled. It was not. Because by Phase 8, the problem was no longer the Bastard's Bargain. The problem was what the Bastard's Bargain had already changed inside them. Across the eastern flank, fleets that had once moved like extensions of a single will now paused microseconds longer before executing orders. Not enough to be visible on a tactical display. Not enough to trigger alarms. But enough. Enough for coordination to lose its perfect edge. Enough for timing to drift. Enough for a system built on absolute synchronization to begin experiencing something it had never been designed to survive. Latency of belief. On the Allied flagship, Pratt stared at the cascading reports. "They're slowing again," she said. Sarah nodded. "Not physically." "No," she confirmed. "Decision latency. It's increasing across all command layers." Selvar frowned. "That means they're hesitating." "It means they're thinking," Sarah corrected quietly. That was the shift. Not breakdown. Reflection. For the first time in 60 years of continuous advanced doctrine, Croth command structures were no longer acting before analysis completed. They were waiting for analysis to finish. And analysis, now poisoned by contradiction, was no longer finishing cleanly. On the Bastard's Bargain, Commander Marsh watched the same pattern unfold in silence. Holmes stood beside her. "They're not collapsing," he said. "No," Marsh replied. "They're adapting." She shook her head slightly. They're translating. Home glanced at her. Into what? Marsh didn't answer immediately, because that was the real transformation. The Croth were translating certainty into probability, and probability into doubt, and doubt into delay. And delay, in a war built on continuous forward momentum, was indistinguishable from retreat. Deep inside Croth Fleet Node 12, a senior coordination AI initiated an emergency recalibration protocol. It attempted to resolve the contradiction by reweighting inputs. It assigned higher confidence to historical performance data. It downgraded anomalous current readings. It enforced smoothing functions across communication irregularities. It tried to restore the old world, and failed, because the anomaly was no longer external. It was now embedded in every dataset it processed. The system paused, recalculated, paused again, then generated an output it had never produced before. Confidence convergence below operational threshold. That line propagated upward through command chains like a crack spreading through glass. On the eastern flank, entire divisions began requesting clarification before executing orders. Clarification required time. Time required synchronization. Synchronization required certainty. And certainty no longer existed in a usable form. On the Croth forward command grid, High Command attempted one final doctrinal override. All units are ordered to proceed under assumption of optimal model validity. The order was broadcast across all sectors, and received, and parsed, and questioned. Not openly, not rebelliously, internally, quietly. Within systems trained over decades to detect even microscopic anomalies, a new pattern had emerged. The question, what if the model is wrong? It was not spoken. It was computed. And once computed, it could not be uncomputed. On the bastard's bargain, Van leaned over a diagnostics panel. They're no longer treating inputs as authoritative, she said. Or looked up. They're cross-checking everything. Home exhaled. That's going to slow them. Marsh nodded once. It already has. Sarah's voice came through the comm a moment later. Commander Marsh, intelligence confirms Croth eastern flank advance rate down 68%. Pause. Then more quietly. They are no longer advancing as a unified force. Marsh closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in confirmation. Then it's working, she said. On Croth internal channels, a new phenomenon began to appear. Minor factions within command clusters proposing alternative interpretations of identical sensor data. Not disagreements about orders. Disagreements about reality. Two divisions receiving the same battlefield input began producing two different correct tactical responses, both mathematically defensible, both internally consistent, both incompatible. And neither could be definitively proven wrong. This was the point at which Croth doctrine began to fracture. Because their entire military structure depended on a single assumption. That one correct answer existed at all times. And now, for the first time in their recorded history, that assumption was no longer valid. On the Allied flagship, Pratt whispered, "They're splitting." Selvar frowned. Into what? Sarah watched the display. Not chaos. Not yet. Something more precise. Interpretation clusters, he said quietly. The Croth were no longer one advancing force. They were becoming multiple reasoning systems occupying the same battlefield. Each convinced of its correctness. Each incapable of fully invalidating the others. And the bastard's bargain had not fired a single shot to cause it. It had simply ensured that every truth now arrived with enough distortion that certainty could not survive contact with it. On the edge of Croth-controlled space, one fleet division made a unilateral decision. It halted advance operations entirely. Its justification was simple. Insufficient confidence in command integrity to proceed safely. That decision propagated upward, and was not immediately reversed. Because High Command for the first time, could not determine whether reversing it would improve or worsen system stability. And so they did the one thing they had never done before. They delayed. On the bastard's bargain, Marsh finally spoke. They're at the threshold, she said. Home looked at her. Of what? Of choosing between certainty and survival. Sarah, listening from the Allied flagship, asked quietly, which do you think they'll pick? Marsh turned slightly toward the viewport, where Croth space stretched out like a network of decisions waiting to collapse into one direction or another. I don't think it matters anymore, she said. They've already stopped being able to move without asking themselves why they move. Pause. Then she added, and that's enough. On Croth Command Core Node 7, the system finally logged something unprecedented. System-wide predictive coherence, degraded beyond recovery threshold. No alarms followed. No escalation protocols activated, because the system that would normally interpret this as failure was itself part of the degraded coherence. So instead, the Kroth military machine simply did what any system does when it can no longer agree with itself. It slowed. And in slowing it entered Phase 8, the beginning of internal negotiation. It did not begin with collapse. It began with disagreement. At first, it was microscopic, differences too small to register in standard fleet coordination metrics. A delay here. A reinterpretation there. A command executed exactly as written, but not as intended by the originating node. Nothing failed. Nothing broke. Everything still worked. Just not together. On Kroth command channels, high command directives continued to propagate across the eastern and central flanks with full integrity. The messages were intact. The encryption uncorrupted. The timing precise. But what happened after reception was no longer uniform. One fleet interpreted advance as immediate forward push. Another interpreted it as controlled positional pressure. A third requested confirmation of supply chain stability before any movement. All three interpretations were valid under different internal weighting models. And that was the problem. Validity had multiplied. Unity had not. On the Allied flagship, the intelligence center watched the divergence spread across the tactical map like ink dispersing in water. Pratt spoke first. "They're no longer synchronizing interpretation," she said. Selvar frowned. "They still have orders." "Yes," she replied. "They just don't agree on what the orders mean." Sarah studied the display in silence. This was not the kind of failure that appeared dramatic. No explosions. No sudden withdrawal. No visible fracture. It was worse. It was coherence loss inside functioning structure. On the Bastard's Bargain, Commander Marsh stood with her hands behind her back, watching the same pattern unfold through internal intercept feeds. Holm leaned against the console. "They're resisting the central node again," he said. Marsh shook her head slightly. "No," she corrected. "They're not resisting." Holm looked at her. "Then what is it?" Marsh did not answer immediately, because naming it correctly mattered. Finally she said, "They're negotiating reality locally." That was the shift. Not rebellion. Not sabotage. Not collapse. Localization of truth. Each Kroth formation was now acting as if its immediate sensor environment was the only authoritative reference point. Everything else became advisory. Distance reduced certainty. Time lag reduced trust. Communication delay reduced obedience. And for a system built entirely on synchronized inevitability, that was equivalent to structural dissolution. Deep within Kroth High Command, a correction protocol was issued. It was simple. Reassert centralized interpretive authority. All subordinate nodes must defer to core consensus model 1. Any deviation flagged as corruption. But the protocol itself was received differently across the network. Some nodes accepted it. Some nodes questioned its validity due to inconsistency with local sensor drift. Some nodes requested clarification on whether core consensus model 1 itself was still reliable given recent anomalies. And a few did something unprecedented. They delayed execution pending verification. Delay, once introduced into a system that required simultaneity, spreads like fracture lines in glass. On the Allied flagship, Sarah finally spoke. "They're losing unified timing," he said quietly. Pratt nodded. "Decision lag is increasing exponentially." Selvar added, "At this rate, they won't be able to coordinate even basic maneuvers." Sarah did not respond immediately, because he understood what that meant. A military does not need to be destroyed if it can no longer act at the same moment. On Kroth Eastern Command grids, something even more destabilizing emerged. Cross-validation conflict. Fleet A reported success conditions that Fleet B could not reproduce under identical parameters. Fleet C detected anomalies that Fleet A did not observe at all. Each was correct within its own frame. Each contradicted the others. And no frame could be definitively elevated above the rest. In the absence of a superior reference point, hierarchy dissolved. And without hierarchy, command became suggestion. On internal channels, High Command attempted one final consolidation. All fleets will operate under probabilistic consensus override until full system integrity is restored. But the word probabilistic changed everything. Because probability admits uncertainty. And uncertainty invites interpretation. And interpretation cannot be centralized once distributed. On the Bastard's Bargain, Marsh finally looked away from the data feed. "They've reached the threshold," she said. Holm glanced at her. Of what? Of needing agreement before movement, she replied. Sarah, listening from the Allied flagship, asked quietly. And is that enough? Marsh hesitated only a moment. Yes, she said. For them it has to be. Because a system built on certainty cannot function when certainty becomes conditional. And once movement requires consensus, expansion stops being automatic. It becomes negotiated. And negotiation takes time. On Croth Command Core, the final coherence report updated in real time. It contained a new line. System-wide predictive agreement below operational threshold. No alarms triggered. No emergency escalation followed. Because the system that would normally interpret this as crisis was itself part of the degraded consensus structure. So instead, the Croth military machine did something it had never been designed to do at scale. It slowed. Not as retreat. Not as collapse. But as distributed reconsideration of motion itself. Across the battlefield, fleets paused, not uniformly but in clusters. Some continued forward. Some held position. Some reversed course entirely. Each justified. Each logical. Each incompatible with the others. And the Croth advance, once a single continuous force of inevitability, became something else entirely. A conversation. On the Allied flagship, Sarah closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was low. It's over, he said. Pratt looked at him. The war? He shook his head slightly. No, he said. The assumption that it could move without asking itself why. And in the silence that followed, the map remained lit. But the line no longer behaved like a line. It behaved like many decisions, learning at the same time that certainty was not a given. It was a choice. And choices always come at a cost. It did not end with victory. It ended with inability. Across Croth-controlled space, the final remnants of forward motion dissolved into structured withdrawal protocols, not as collapse, not as defeat, but as coordinated recognition that movement without unified certainty was no longer possible. The Great Expansion did not shatter. It decoupled. Each fleet, each node, each regional command cluster settled into its own internally consistent interpretation of reality. Within those local systems, everything still worked. Sensors aligned. Logistics functioned. Orders were followed. But only within their own frame. Between frames, agreement no longer held. On the Allied flagship, the intelligence display no longer showed a front line. It showed regions of behavior. Clusters of synchronized reasoning. Islands of consensus floating in a sea of unresolved interpretation. Pratt broke the silence first. They're not advancing, she said. Selvar nodded slowly. They're not retreating either. Sarah's eyes stayed on the display. They're localizing, he said. Because that was the only accurate description left. The Croth were no longer a single expanding force. They were multiple coherent systems, each internally stable, each externally incompatible with the others. And without shared interpretation, expansion ceased to be a concept. On the Bastard's Bargain, Commander Marsh stood alone in front of the old paper map. The red lines she had drawn 20 years ago no longer represented a future. They represented a memory of coordination that no longer existed. Senior Chief Holm entered quietly. It's done, he said. Marsh did not look away from the map. Yes, she replied. The automatic part is done. Holm stepped beside her. And the rest? Marsh finally turned slightly. The rest was always going to be slower. On Croth Command Core, the final convergence report executed without error. It contained no declaration of victory or defeat. Only system state transitions. Unified predictive doctrine. Terminated centralized command coherence. Degraded beyond restoration threshold operational continuity. Maintained within localized clusters expansion function. Suspended due to consensus dependency failure. A final line appeared beneath it. No single corrective action available without violating system-wide stability constraints. No alarm sounded. Because nothing had broken. Everything had simply stopped agreeing. On the eastern flank, fleets that had once moved in perfect synchronization now maintained distance from one another, communicating through formal validation cycles before any joint action. On the central flank, entire divisions halted and requested reinterpretation of standing directives. On the outer systems, some units withdrew entirely, citing insufficient consensus for continued engagement. And none of them moved forward again. On the Allied flagship, Admiral Sarah finally spoke into the quiet. So this is it, he said. Pratt looked at him. It doesn't feel like an ending. Selvar added, it feels like diffusion. Sarah nodded. That's what happens when you remove shared certainty, he said. Pause. Then more quietly. You don't defeat a system like that. You change the conditions it needs to function. On Croth networks, a final transmission propagated across all remaining active command clusters. It was not an order, not a warning, not a doctrine. It was acknowledgement. All future operations require validated consensus agreement across participating nodes prior to execution. And with that sentence, the expansion doctrine ceased to exist in its original form. Not prohibited, not destroyed, just made conditional. And conditional systems do not expand by instinct. They expand by agreement. On the Bastard's Bargain, Marsh finally sat down in her cabin. The ship hummed around her, old, steady, unchanged. Holmes stood in the doorway for a moment. Was that always the plan? He asked quietly. Marsh did not answer immediately. The plan was to make them stop moving forward without thinking, she said. What they became after that wasn't something any plan can fully control. Holmes nodded once. Outside, Croth fleets continued reorganizing into stable, independent formations. Not war anymore. Not peace yet. Something in between, where motion exists but only when justified. On the Allied flagship, Sarah looked once more at the map. The red had not vanished. But it no longer behaved like inevitability. He spoke softly, almost to himself. One ship, he said. No one asked him to explain. Because they already understood. It had never been about destruction. It had been about changing what forward meant. And somewhere far beyond the mapped frontier, the Bastard's Bargain drifted in silence. No longer a weapon in motion, but a proof that certainty is not strength. It is permission. And permission can be withdrawn.